Okay. So thanks for that reminder, Jenna. That would be a bummer if we weren't going to record. Okay, so welcome. What we can do to start while we're waiting for everyone to join, and before I introduce our panelists, is go ahead and click on the chat button, and that's at the bottom, and it just says chat, and go ahead and let us know, where are you sitting today? So I am sitting in San Luis Obispo County, California. Jenna said she's in Boston. Yeah, go ahead and try out the chat and let us know where you are. Davis, California, Los Angeles. Oh, cool. People from all over Michigan, New York, Alabama, Illinois, Wisconsin. Cool. Philadelphia, New Mexico, the UK. Okay, so we're an international audience today. Awesome. Wow. Okay, and now we have 83 people and counting on the call. Great. Okay, and now from Oakland. Okay, great. Welcome. Let us know in the chat if this is your first time joining for our A Better Normal conversation, and I'll let you know what that is in a second. Is this your first time, second time, third time, fourth, 10th? I have a feeling there's a lot of first timers. Great. Awesome. Wow. Second. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. Wow. Thanks for your engagement, everyone. I really appreciate that. So let me tell you a little bit about ACEs Connection. So we're a movement to prevent ACEs, heal trauma, and build resilience. And so ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so our organization was founded in 2012 by Jane Stevens, who had gotten very familiar with the original ACEs study that was published in 1998 that showed that if you had a higher number of adverse childhood experiences, which include experiences like abuse, neglect, substance misuse in the home growing up, violence, these types of experiences, divorce, that if you had a higher number of adverse childhood experiences, that your likelihood, your risk of developing different negative health conditions later on in life was much higher. And so here at ACEs Connection, we are dedicated to helping people understand the relationship between childhood trauma and different adult or different health outcomes throughout a person's life. And we're very much committed to educating people about these links in an effort to reduce child abuse and neglect and childhood trauma. And so that's our mission. Today is, let me tell you about A Better Normal. So A Better Normal is our vision. In light of the pandemic and sheltering at home, we thought, what could we do to help cultivate community? So we launched this series. It happens Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays here in Zoom. We're all living the Zoom life to talk about different topics so that we can envision society as trauma informed. And so we have been welcoming different panelists on different topics to help us envision a more equitable society that takes into account the fact that when we reduce disparities, health disparities, and create a more equitable world, then we're creating the kind of society that we want to live in. So today is a special day that we are honoring both Pride Month and Juneteenth. And so I just want to give a little bit of background because I know that not every person in America or internationally understands, especially Juneteenth, which has been a pretty recent holiday on our radar for those of us who grew up with the very the kinds of history textbooks that we did, which maybe, I don't know, maybe Mark and Alex, you want to speak on that in a bit. A lot of untruths. So Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States, dating back to 1865. It was on June 19th that the Union soldiers, led by Major General Gordon Granger, landed in Galveston, Texas with the news that the war had ended and that the enslaved were now free. Note that this was 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had become official on January 1st, 1863. And then I wanted to say a little bit about Pride Month, which commemorates, is commemorated in June because of the Stonewall riots, which had occurred at the end of June 1969. So that's why we are honoring both of those events today with our panelists. So let me introduce our speakers. So today we are honored to be joined by first my co-moderator, Jenna Quinn, who works as our health communication coordinator at ACEs Connection. And she recently got her Master's of Public Health at Boston University School of Public Health. We'll be co-moderating today. So we are joined here by Reverend Dr. D. Mark Wilson. He's an African-American clergy person ordained in the American Baptist Churches of the United States. He's a former senior pastor of McGee Avenue Baptist Church in Berkeley, where he served for 12 years. And he earned his undergraduate degree from Howard University, his Master's of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. He is the current director of music at Easter Hill United Methodist Church and the former assistant professor of congregational leadership at the Pacific School of Religion. In addition to his work as a pastor, he is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at St. Mary's College in California. And he's a continuing lecturer in the music department at UC Berkeley, which is how I know him. I took his gospel choir in college and had the honor of having him be one of my teachers. And so he uses musical performance to create diversity and global justice throughout the community and world, including in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Sri Lanka. I want to introduce Alexander Cho. He is an expert in LGBTQ youth digital media use, race and ethnicity, and digital design. He is the University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow in Informatics at UC Irvine and the incoming Assistant Professor of Asian American Studies at UC Santa Barbara, which congratulations on that recent appointment, Alex, and I'm so excited that we're going to be neighbors. He is co-author of The Digital Edge, How Black and Latino Youth Navigate Digital Inequality, and the co-editor of the forthcoming A Tumblr Book, Platform and Cultures. He is active in policy and advocacy settings, most recently working with UNICEF as the lead author of the report, Digital Civic Engagement by Young People. So thank you all so much. I want to invite participants here to go ahead and put your questions and comments in the chat as we go. And we will then call on you and unmute you to share your comment out loud. I want to let you know, and this is something that Ingrid did when she led a talk last week, is to let you know that this is a safe space. So please feel safe to ask your comments and questions. Even if you feel a little bit uncomfortable or feel that you're unsure about something, please do feel safe to ask those or make your comments. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jenna.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you both to Mark and Alex for being here today. I just want to thank you again so much for this opportunity for me to be here and to listen to you both speak and to have you tell us in this Better Normal session about exactly what your work is. So I just wanted to start off by announcing ACEs Connection's newest community today. And we're also joined by the co-manager of this community, Mary, who, if anybody's watching, she's wearing pink, if you can see her. The new community is titled the Rainbow Resilience Connection of LGBTQ Survivors, and I can put the link to it in the chat if anybody's interested in joining. We just announced this new community today in honor of Pride Month. So thank you, everybody. So the first question I have is that I'm a recent public health graduate. I'm a white person, I'm bisexual. So my first question to you both is, what do I need to know and what do we all need to know about the current historical and racial trauma that's happening? What do I need to know as a young white person? Thank you.
Mark?
Sure, I'll go ahead and respond. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And before I kind of respond, in the African tradition, we honor elders. before we get their permission, I want to honor the power and presence of my grandmother, whose birthday is today. The reason I knew about June 19th was because when we celebrated her birthday, she always had to tell me the June 19th story, particularly of how slaves in the South did not know that they were free, and they were free already, and they were still working on plantations. For a young bisexual white person, in terms of talking about historical trauma with LGBTQ identity and racial identity, I guess there are two things that come out of Juneteenth. One is that the message about there's so many of us who are free, who can be free, but don't know it. The queer youth with whom I work here in the Bay Area, I think there's older ones of us who are LGBTQ who feel like, oh, there's a new day. It's so easy for them to come out. In some cases, yes, but in a lot of cases, no. I mean, I work with them and seen the toughest hour is that hour between going from school to home still. What else I would like the younger LGBTQ people to know is about Black Power movement. Black lives, about the movement that Black lives that's currently part of our current political and cultural discussion just didn't start yesterday, but there's a long history of movements that out of which it grew. It's a shame that the schools don't teach one perspective of American history, but that kind of gears toward white male cisgendered men, and don't go back to just the 1619 of immigrants who were from Europe, but they weren't citizens of the United States. They were indentured servants, and the relationships they had with African slaves and how they came together to rebel and to overthrow the elite. And for that reason, the elite came up with the definitions of race to keep them divided so that they would never get together again. And voila, we've got today where it's much of the same. We're so divided and don't realize it was created in the beginning of America for us to be divided. I'd like a young person to know about that history. And then finally, I think about Stonewall in 1969. Like young queer people, bisexual and white, to know just not about the white gays and lesbians who are memorialized in a monument in front of the Stonewall Inn, but know about the transgender, primarily transgender people of color who threw the first blows of Stonewall in terms of identity. And there's, with the trauma that we see with transgender or gender variant young people, knowing that history, I think, makes a difference. That they're included, not only included, but important to the movement, and need to be highly embraced. I'll stop there.
I muted myself. Thanks, Mark. I had promised you some opening comments, and then we threw in a question at you. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to introduce yourself, or?
No, I'm a bit gay man. That's what this is, from the 1980s. I cherish the acknowledgments in the 1980s gay literary movement led by Marlon Riggs and Essex Hemphill, who were encouraged to write by Black feminists like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks and others, because they were the ones under who taught men of my generation not to be silent, that we had to speak and had to write. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark. Alex.
Hi, thank you again for having me and for putting me in such esteemed company. It's a great honor to be here today. I think that I want to start by probably doing what I do, which is teach a little bit. I teach classes on media, representation, race, gender, and sexuality. And I definitely want to second the Reverend's invocation just now of Marlon Riggs. If you are not familiar with his work, definitely look it up. I'm pretty sure there are venues, perhaps through public libraries, that you can find his video work, for example. Very, very influential Black gay filmmaker. The two I would recommend are Tongues Untied and Ethnic Notions. I show those to my students, and you know, mind blown. So I would absolutely recommend those. Just very briefly, I wanted to frame my remarks first with one of the most powerful quotes that I've ever read, which is from a very famous queer of color scholar. His name was Jose Esteban Munoz, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. And I actually use this in my teaching as well. And this is a quote from his 1999 book, Disidentifications. And the quote is, "I always marvel at the ways in which non-white children survive a white supremacist US culture that preys on them. I am equally in awe of the ways in which queer children navigate a homophobic public sphere that would rather they did not exist. The survival of children who are both queerly and racially identified is nothing short of staggering." Okay, so this is writing in the 90s, you know, well before all of the kind of general wokeness, I think, that we see beginning to permeate the culture today. So I just wanted to start off with that. The thing that I wanted to offer is I want to offer just an invocation of the baseline concept of intersectionality, which I think we hear a lot today. And Jenna, this I think is also an answer to your question. But I'm not sure that, well, I would just like for everyone you know, involved today to come out of this with a very clear understanding of what that concept is. So when I teach that, I teach it in terms of the idea of your identity can be thought of like as a braid. And I get this from an amazing Black female teacher of mine, actually, University of Texas. When you think of a braid, you have multiple different facets, right, that must come together. And without all of those facets, there at the same time, the braid does not exist. So what does that mean? That means that you cannot think of a person and identity just along the axis of gender, just along the axis of race, just along the axis of sexuality, just along the axis of class or ability/disability, right? All of those things are tied together. This comes out of, it's most recently associated with a brilliant legal scholar whose name is Kimberly Crenshaw, where she talks about, hey, you know, it's not enough to just talk about violence against women, right? We have to actually talk about violence against women of color. And that's a very distinct category with much higher rates of violence. And it's a talk back to also a kind of earlier feminist movement, which assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that the kind of public face of woman was a white woman, and that actually there are more facets. It's not just about women, it's about women plus X plus Y plus Z, right? I would also suggest that folks maybe even trace this all the way back to Sojourner Truth in the mid-19th century, famous African-American abolitionist women's rights advocate, and her very famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman," right? Where she talks about in 1851 to a group of majority white women at the time who were advocating for suffrage, your suffrage and your experience is not the same as mine, right? As a Black woman in the United States pre-Civil War, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to offer here. And I wanted to also kind of slice a little bit and say that this is a parallel but different concept than diversity, which refers to in a group of people having multiple backgrounds, perspectives, etc., right? So those things work together, but they are not the same. And so I just wanted to offer that out there as kind of a framework for talking going forward in terms of the different kinds of ways that trauma collects on different kinds of bodies, specifically having to do with the histories of the systems that we all live with today.
Wow, thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciated you taking the time to teach us a few things to kick us off. Mark, did you have a response at all? Anything that made you think of? Oh, he's gone. Oh, here we are. Let's see. I gotta unmute you.
No, I went to my library, which was right here,
Okay.
to pull up my the first anthology of Black gay men. That I didn't know that we were going to get into the conversation of the 1980s. And when you brought up Marlon Riggs, Marlon also taught film and at UC Berkeley before he passed away. I did his funeral in 1994 in Berkeley at McGee Avenue Baptist Church, which also drew me into the HIV/AIDS work in California, and was at his bedside a number of times before he passed away. Yeah, that whole message of intersectionality that was developing at that time, that came out of from the African American women who were part of the feminist movement, carried on in this literature. We call this the Bible, basically, in the life in Black gay circles, because when you were reading that statement, there's the quote that you read from the writing. It's so familiar to Joseph Beam's writings of Brother to Brother, Words from the Heart, which was a hope that by the year 2000 that there would be a cure for HIV and AIDS, that discussions of gender and sexuality would be all over, that little children who are queer would know themselves and all. And I think with intersectionality, which the difficulty I find, I mean, it's wonderful in terms of the dialogue, but I guess my question is that I put out there about it is within the framework, how we embrace the messiness of it. My students expecting we get intersectional, and intersectionality is not easy. And does it need to be easy? Can we raise a question about, isn't it a change in a way of thinking that everything has to be so much in order? How about living with a little chaos? Ecology does that. I mean, or you hear beeping going down the street right now. That's probably the Black Lives Matter movement going down Lakeshore Avenue where I live. But it's chaos. It can be chaotic. And also I have to tell my students, it's just like, don't expect this to be an easy discussion. Easy in some cases, not in others. Because when it gets conflictual, that's when we run to our silos, and then that togetherness and unity is no longer there. So I just want to put out that in terms of intersectionality. I'm sorry, that is Black Lives Matter. They're coming down the street here.
That's amazing. Yeah, I want to maybe in that vein, how has it been for you, Mark, the past several months, with some of the protests and the unrest, and how are you doing? Like, how is your mental health, or how do you feel?
Oh, I guess the word resiliency is there. It's just like, I don't know, I'm rather numb.
Okay.
It just, when you live with, when you live with them with experience for so long, I'll be 60 this year. And when we've lived not only through the police shootings that are current, but also through the beatings of Rodney King and Malice Green in Detroit that we had marches for. Malice Green, in Detroit, we made murals. When you've seen and heard the beatings of friends and experienced, kind of being followed yourself by security officers in white neighborhoods when you're 12 years old. I mean, the Black Power movement back in the early 60s taught us, I think it taught little Black boys like me at 9 and 10 years old that you had to stand up and even though you're afraid of the inside, you better look bad, or with some drag friends of mine in P-Town, you don't mess with those girls, you can be afraid on the outside, but you had to give a tough interior. But I've kind of just been numb about it because it's just the same thing over and over and over again. To some extent, I get a bit, it's kind of interesting, my white friends who are calling me and apologizing for things that I'm like, well, what are you doing? Or asking me questions. One I just emailed back yesterday to say, he was asking me about the images on that are being changed by the white corporations for pancakes and syrup. And I just said to him, go look online. This stuff is all online. I have to learn it myself, Go read a book. And if you have any questions, come back to me, What are you apologizing for? Do the history, but that, do I educate? It's important to be in dialogue, or do I, in terms of my mental health, well, that's always been out of whack being Black and gay. So, between seeing people to help me and chanting my mother's moans and chants, and taking my medications for a variety of things, I tend to manage. But that cannot be so easy, particularly more so. I'm too worried about economics and being a Black gay man at my age, older senior, getting ready to go in the 60s, whose finances are very unstable right now. And I see that the questions about LGBT, that's something else I think for younger LGBT people to think about, those of us who are aging. And there's a lot in terms of mental health, LGBTQ people, loneliness by yourself. If your partner passed away, grief. There are still gay men today who are grieving their partner's death or their friend's death over HIV and AIDS. And I don't know if we'll get through that. And the answer, sometimes there's a lot of substance use, I would say. Not only for the younger people, but over older people who are LGBTQ, and the need to look at that.
Thank you so much for your vulnerability, Mark. I just wanted to comment, as a person with a lot of privilege, I'm white, I'm cisgendered, I'm straight. It was important for me to host this conversation today, to be not just an ally, but someone who takes action to start these conversations and to help continue the conversation and discussion. And but I also would just want to acknowledge that for those of us who are white and straight, that it isn't your job to educate us, and that's our job. And so I just want to say how grateful I am for both of you being here and taking on this role, which is not your job. And there are resources, infinite resources available to us anytime that we want to educate ourselves. And so, thank you so much for showing up in this space and being vulnerable and taking the time to create this space. So I can see a lot of nodding. So I know that the people here who are on this call feel that same gratitude. If any of you want to write any messages in the chat of gratitude, Alex, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the Reverend's statements, because I think they're very powerful, and I do not think that, well, I think that we need to stay with them for a second, because for me, and this ties into Jenna's first question as well, we talk about, what white allies can do, what is the perspective here? And I think that, as you mentioned, Allison, the very first thing is education. So I'm seeing a lot of people discoursing today about systems and structures, which is fantastic, right? I'm loving the fact that we've gone beyond, well, have you ever been called a name or something as like the only evidence of racism? I think there's a lot more discussion that we still need to have about structures. For example, I've actually not read the book White Fragility, but a book that I wish was getting more play in kind of the ecosystem is a classic text now, which is written by the sociologist George Lipsitz, and it's called The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. And he is so good at tracking the receipts on the systems that enable us to understand very starkly why Black people, particularly in the United States, have been historically excluded quite deliberately and on purpose from generating intergenerational systems of wealth transfer, right? I always teach this too. And I ask my students, if you are lucky enough to have grown up in a house that your parents owned, where did they get the money to get the down payment for that house, right? Were they all, working, 12 hours a day? Probably, but that's still probably not enough to afford a down payment on a house, right? Other things like even getting a car, having your parents bail you out of a ticket, having your parents bail you out of jail, right? All of these things are the first moments on that really slippery slope. And I think that white allies need to understand that it's not just about kind of acknowledging the privilege, but actually doing the hard work of doing the detective work in your family. So we talk about affirmative action. We never talk about the fact that the Homestead Act of 1863 was the biggest affirmative action move that the United States has ever made, which was basically, if you were white, you would get a certain amount of free land in the middle of the country. And think about 1863 and think about who was not able to take advantage of that for many reasons, right? When I teach in Texas, which is where I taught in Texas, I asked them, how many of your family can trace back your wealth to this literal free giveaway by the federal government that was something like 90-something% ended up being doled out to white families. And we see this go on and on and on. In Lipsitz's book, I don't believe it was until, and this, fact check me on this, please read the book and fact check me, but I don't believe it was until 1974 that the federal government explicitly outlawed racial bias in home lending, right? So we know that home is the single biggest generator of wealth for any white family in the United States. So these are the kinds of things, and I might be veering away a little bit from the Pride Month discussion, but I also want to maybe close this statement by saying that's also evidence, I think, that in an intersectional lens, white gays have very different experiences than Black gays, right? And it's not just about a beauty regime, about who is in front of the camera, it is, but it is also that intersectional understanding of your family and your wealth and where you come from, all of that kind of thing. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Can I respond to that? Because that is just, I think the last statement you made was so important when we were talking earlier in the pre-discussion about BU, and you're going to BU, right? It was right down the street when I was a club kid back in the 1980s, my Jerry curl and everything. We won't talk about that. But the bars that were the whole scene of the club scene, we were very aware of who was let in the clubs and who was not let in the clubs. If you were Black and gay, or a person of color, I would say, and gay, because there was mainly Puerto Rican, Latino, Dominican, and you came to that door, they would tell you, go home and change. You cannot come here with jeans on. You say, well, there are 3 white guys who walked in. Well, this was in the Castro in San Francisco too, those codes. Or you need to have 3 pieces of ID in order to walk into this space. And I remember being a grad student, I just got I had my ID from Harvard, my driver's license. And I said, I have an idea. I pull up my credit card to get in. And I said, wait, whoa, what am I doing? Or we would go back home and change our clothes. And then finally one night we just looked at each other like, why are we doing this? We're trying to be so accepted to the standard of whiteness and to their gaze that that we were willing to hand them my credit card and everything else. So thank you, Alex, for bringing that up and for mentioning that intersection.
Thank you both so much for answering for my question and for those comments. I wanted to call on Michael McCarthy about the comment he made regarding Mark's comments about gay and gray. If you're okay if I unmute you, Michael.
Sure, yes.
Okay, we can hear you now.
What would you like me to elaborate on that? Tell you where I went to school? Yeah, I went to school at
I can't see, I didn't see it, so maybe if you could repeat it and then elaborate.
Okay. What I said was the topic of gay and gray was very interesting because I was trying to research some of that at a clinical psychology program in the Bay Area, and their database didn't even have access to the Hallward and Harrington Park journals that covered that. I thought that was interesting because I could have stayed in Detroit and had access to those things at Wayne State or especially U of M or something like that. I thought that was ironic because you'd think that the Bay Area would feature those kind of journals. just another barrier, you know, to becoming more woke.
Just to clarify, you're mentioning that you were able to access particular kinds of journals, academic journals, texts, things like that in a different place, for example, in Michigan, but not in
Yeah.
Oakland, perhaps through the library. Is that what you were using?
Yeah, through the library database. You know, it's all online now. When I first started going to school in the 1990s, it was on a disk database.
Gotcha.
Journals were.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, so I'll just offer one very quick, like, you know, observation there. I mean, that's part of the structure, right?
Yeah,
which community, and I'm assuming if you're referring to University of Michigan, I'm assuming you're referring to Ann Arbor, right? At University of Michigan, which was one of the most well-resourced and also potentially quite problematic in terms of racial history,
yes.
universities in the country. But they have a lot of money in order to provide folks who live in that community, and you know, a lot of people who live in Ann Arbor are affiliated with that community, versus in Oakland or Bay Area, right? And so I think that's a really great example of even the infrastructure of knowledge being influenced by uneven wealth, which has to do with race and the history of disproportionate distribution.
I did complain about it, and I was told that they belong to a consortium of universities in the Bay Area, and this was all shared. So I don't know who was in that consortium, who wasn't, but not having access to that, you know, it was, like you said, a structural barrier. I was very interested in that topic too, because, you know, I'm going to be there one of these days.
Thank you so much, Michael, for bringing that up, and thank you for your comment. I got a private message from a friend about, and this kind of prompted me to maybe bring the issue of gender into our conversation. Because this friend of ours, Alex, mentioned that apart from the panelists and a few guests, the majority of the people on this call are women. And that's a theme. That's a theme for, I mean, I want to mention that Alex was saying, well, we want to make sure that we have representation from other genders and other sexual identities on our panel. And I said, well, actually, it's going to be pretty new to have men on our panel. Because typically in the trauma space, we're used to seeing a lot of women talk about trauma, and we're not used to seeing as many men show up in these spaces. Even on our staff at ACEs Connection, we have only one male staff member out of a total of 16 staff. And so I just was maybe wondering if I could present that to both of you. Why is it that, or what is your hunch as to maybe why we aren't seeing as many men show up to talk about trauma?
Well, I say, first of all, I don't want to make any assumptions about gender and identity of everyone who's here. Got to get into binary sort of male, men, women, when there might be such a variety of gender identities that are present online here. I guess maybe I might go to the whole socialization of men and traditional hypermasculinity, the types of things that we can talk about and not talk about. You know, I was fortunate to be raised mostly by my mother, my older four sisters, and my grandmother. And so, you know, in those spaces, I enjoy being a gay kid. That was just wonderful. They were always kicking me out the kitchen. I wanted to be a women's space so much because, you know, I enjoyed it. But my friends, you know, who had dads and kind of this really tough, hyper-masculine notions in society that were very uncomfortable. I still think those notions about strength, about aggression, that men don't cry, and they're very, very strong sanctioning for it. I find students who write papers in my classes as an undergrad, some who come out to me, but they're saying the fear there is so much about how their friends will respond to them, even in terms of just hurt and violence. They'll write about it privately in a paper, but not speak on it. I think that also exists in gay men's community. I mean, all our icons, you know, the Marlboro Man, you know, the construction worker, you know. I had a friend of mine saying, you know, what is our feeling about dating a femme man, you know, and all those discussions. There's just these notions that continue, and they still need to be talked about, deconstructed in some way, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. Alex?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about that. I absolutely agree with everything Reverend Wilson has said. I mean, one thing that we know is that if you are part of and this is again why intersectional lenses are so important. If you are part of a community that is disenfranchised on one axis, then maybe you overcompensate by performing hyper masculinity, for example. Like if you are disenfranchised on the axis of race as a Black man, maybe you compensate in terms of, you know, self-esteem and power by adopting a hyper-masculine comportment, right? Not to even mention the LGBT angle, perhaps, you know, thrown in there as well. So I want to also echo Reverend Wilson's observation at the very top, being like, it's messy, it's complicated, right? All of these ways of understanding are kind of post facto, right? The lived experience of being in a body is very messy. But hopefully, you know, through seminars like this reorganization, we can maybe kind of think about ways to tease those things out and identify. I wanted to talk a little bit about that actually, because in terms, I think this brings it back to the subject of trauma and what we deal with as young people. I mean, the statistics, which many of you probably are already familiar with, excuse me, are shocking. You know, just pulling from the Trevor Project earlier, LGBT youth generally, 33% report being bullied on school property versus heterosexual youth, straight youth, 17.1%. In terms of LGBT, trans folks are incredibly disproportionately affected, even within that moniker. But in terms of LGBT youth, suicide attempts are 5 times greater than straight youth. And trans adults, 40% of trans adults say they have attempted suicide at one point in their lifetime. LGBT youth from quote unquote highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide versus LGBT youth who come from families with no or low levels of family rejection. So we see this, you know, from the very, very beginning, you know, of a person's kind of life experience. And another thing to point out, again, intersectionality is very important. These statistics are not intersectional, right? Like there's no race contained in here. So I had to dig a little bit more to get intersectional statistics. For example, the National Center for Transgender Equality in 2015 says that according to a nationwide survey of trans people, 38% of Black trans people live in poverty in the United States versus 12% of the general population and versus 29% of the general trans population, right? And that this is a statistic that I did not know that really shocked me. 51% of Black trans women have experienced homelessness in their life. Most of Black trans women have experienced homelessness in their life, right? So I just wanted to put that out there in terms of the kind of magnitude of traumas that we're talking about here, coupled with the need for an intersectional lens. And then the last thing I'll say is this conversation has reminded me of something that I really forgot about, but from a very foundational queer theory author whose name was Eve Sedgwick. And she talks a lot about the idea of queer youth growing up in a paranoid state. Not in the sense of like the kind of like just run-of-the-mill paranoia that, you know, you might think of like a tinfoil hat or something like that, right? Like that's not what we're talking about. What she's talking about is the literal understanding that if you make the wrong move, you could be assaulted, right? You could be beaten up. And so what she asserts is that a lot of LGBTQ youth develop this kind of way of being constantly hypervigilant, being constantly anticipatory of everything in the room, and being constantly afraid of making a mistake. So what about the luxury of being able to make a mistake, right? And so her amazing quote, which I think she actually quotes someone else in some of her writing, but is perhaps what some of the reparative work that we need to do as LGBTQ folks, especially I would say LGBTQ folks of color, and that we hopefully would be supported by, you know, practitioners and other people, is to quote, take the terror out of error, to realize that you can make a mistake without getting beaten up. You can let your guard down a little bit, right? So anyway, I just wanted to offer that up there as well, because that's something that was generated in the last round of discussion.
And we'd like to insert with that when we talked about the structures that need to change in some social institutions. I can't come into this discussion as a Baptist clergy person and not talk about the importance of changing religious structures and how foundational those are. You know, even in gay communities, at gay resorts, sitting with gay men and having a social, even if they say they're not and go to a church or not religious, still those morals are back in their mind somewhere. You know, or that, you know, am I an abomination, a bad creation? And I take responsibility for being in my teen years when I was first coming out as 14 years old, struggling with those dynamics of, is God going to damn me, condemn me? Well, I just will bury this. Being as, you know, friends of mine in undergrad remember me probably more as homophobic and sexist up until age 21 years old, you know, because I bought into all that. And yet on the other side of that, when Alex was talking about what we need to transform, I think we need also, for people of color there, done a lot of writing on the subcultures of subcultures of queerness in Black congregations. Now my more political gay friends, you know, say you're talking about people are silent, but it's just like, have you listened to this gospel song? And why this musician is playing all around the notes and in between and queering the music, you know, making it very strange on this traditional hymn. He's saying something about his struggle. And if you know the codes that are going on, Lipschitz writes about this. I got this from him, in fact, in one of his earlier writings about kind of creative noise. Anyway, but if you plugged into the codes, and sometimes you go to church, why do people ask the question, why do gay men in the Black church can support them? Well, sometimes we see our friends there. You know, sometimes sometimes it's so much fun and entertainment going on under the heterosexuals, you know. And the question is that, does it add to our oppression, or are we empowering each other to do, as you said, sort of making this creative resiliency, you know, looking at house cultures that were built, that when a child was put out their homes, it's all imposed now, who are transgender, and the rituals of the house culture, the coming out ceremonies, the mixing together of house music that people, you know, those who developed it called house because it was in the house culture, bringing together gospel music and disco music. And so I just wonder whether they're looking at these homegrown ways that the community has responded and have found resiliency to say to the structures, even if you damn me, I'm going to make it anyhow.
Any response, Alex? If you.
Oh no, that just reminds me of one short thing that I'll say is that I realized that in offering statistics such as the ones that I offered, it's very easy to think of communities of queer folks of color as like incredibly victimized, which on some level is true. But I think what the Reverend is rightfully pointing out is that people are resilient, right? And kids are resilient. That was the Munoz quote that I started with he marvels at the resilient strategy of survival. He's staggered by it, right? And so the idea that even in any kind of space where we may not think queer stuff is going on, there might be a subtext where those in the know are communicating through code, through resilient acts, through nonverbal perhaps identification, and having a kind of almost kind of like a James Bond-esque kind of strategy of forming community and being resilient in a way that purposefully evades attention.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about how how I know both of you to cultivate resilience. I mean, Mark, through your spiritual practice, through inspiring others. I mean, throughout the past several months, which have been have taken a mental toll on every person because of the pandemic, and then also with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and a lot of the unrest that's happening, is that you continue to be a voice of joy and inspiration to all of us who get to follow your posts on social media. And I just want to say thank you. And I see you cultivating that resilient spirit also through music, which has been so healing. And then Alex, I think through your academic discourse, I almost wonder if that's a way for you to cultivate healing, because you're saying, okay, this is really hurting. This is a weighty trauma. How can I examine this and in so doing work to heal some of this pain? Is that a correct interpretation?
Or I don't know. I think the joy comes out. I say sometimes I laugh to keep from crying. Just on the code and resilience, I had a lesbian student in class. I had to write this paper about symbols and coming out. And she's like, I don't have to come out. It's in my haircut. If you know what this haircut means, then you'll know who I am. But sometimes we do. The joy has come out of, I listen to the gospel music that's created. Some of those songs are about joy. Some of those songs are about pain. Somebody says, in the midst of isolation, Lord, speak peace. Lord, speak peace. Those who are in the know that's written by a lesbian author. And what is she saying? Or when Gaiman writes, "Hold back the night, give me strength to fight," and he says that I was writing that from the hospital room. His life was gone from HIV and AIDS. So I guess it's like when I'm facing the mental issues and the trauma, I'll say I wait on what comes deep from my soul is really my mom's chants, the moans that go back to history of suffering and trauma that I didn't even know about, that had been passed down to me probably through my DNA and other places. And it springs out of my soul. And when I hear the music and all, and I definitely, I enjoy it, but it comes out of, sometimes I don't create it. I guess that's what I'm saying. It creates and holds me. It jumps out at times. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes. I think we might go just a couple minutes over, because I want to make sure that Jenna, you have the opportunity to talk with Mary about it's celebrating the launch of our new community just for a minute, and then we'll do some closing remarks. And I invite you, Reverend Mark and Alex, to take a look at the chat. There's many words of gratitude in there for your sharing today. So Jenna.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Mark and Alex. Mary, is it okay if I unmute you and you can say a few words with me about the community? Okay, I'm gonna unmute you. Okay, perfect.
Hi.
Hi. Do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I've been involved with ACEs Connection for, over almost 2 years now. I'm actually the community manager for my local area, the Orange County area in Southern California. And when Jenna approached me about heading up or co-leading this LGBTQ community, it was, near and dear to my heart. I've been an out lesbian for the past 30 years and advocating for the community. And now that I'm so clear about how trauma, early childhood trauma on top of being LGBTQ is, just we all need a lot of support. Let me just put it that way. And I put something in the chat actually that LGBTQ sexual minorities have 50% higher rates of alcoholism and substance abuse, as well as mental health disorders. So, and that's, obviously due to the trauma that, we endure by living in a homophobic culture. And so, and then there's so much trauma on practicing an addiction. I've been in recovery for many years, thank God. But just being in an active addiction is traumatizing in and of itself. And so I'm really excited about bringing forth support and safety and community for people that are LGBTQ or those that are friendly to this community, so that we can all find connection, because that's what we lost, or that some of us still feel lost and not feeling connected due to the trauma. So thank you, Jenna, for the opportunity, and I'm excited to serve and be a part of it.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, so I started at ACEs Connection in February, and I was kind of surprised because, as Allison mentioned, we have a number of interest-based communities on ACEs Connection that line up with people's identities in different ways, and we didn't have one for the LGBTQ community, so I'm really happy that we have one of those now. And I'll put the link again in the chat in case anybody wants to join.
Yeah, and please put the word out to everybody that we're out here, and we're here to support anybody in embracing who they are and fully shining their light in the world. So
thank you so much, Jenna and Mary. Thank you for dropping that link in, Jenna. I just want to invite you all, if you are new to ACEs Connection, that you came here through some other path other than hearing about it from us, I invite you to join our community. We have over 44,000 community members of people who are interested in trauma healing work. So just go to acesconnection.com and click join. We invite each and every one of you to make posts to join communities. Jenna just posted the link to this new community, which was just launched today. And I just want to say, if everyone wants to kind of do like a clap, congratulations. And so it's been such an honor, Mark and Alex, to have you help us celebrate us taking this big step forward and being even more inclusive on ACEs Connection. And I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that oftentimes people of color, people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, do a lot of emotional labor on behalf of people like me. And I really wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that and say thank you, that you all often are doing the hard work of helping us feel comfortable, which is not your job. And I just want to say thank you. And I want to take a moment to honor the weightiness of the traumas that you listed, Alex. And I want to also say to anyone who's listening who feels triggered, the Trevor Project is a great resource and hotline. I did drop that link in there, so please do take advantage of that if you are feeling triggered in any way as a result of this conversation. And then I just wanted to acknowledge that as we talk about traumas, the traumas that people of color or people of the LGBTQ plus or the intersectional communities take on is often at a much higher risk than the traumas that those of us who take on who are in more privileged positions. And oftentimes it's the risk of your life. And I just wanted to honor that in this conversation, that I'm seeing that. So thank you both for educating us so that we can learn more and create an even more peaceful society that's equitable for all. And it's been such an honor to have you. And I welcome any closing remarks from either Mark or Alex or both of you, and then we can go ahead and close out. And thank you all so much for being here. I've got to unmute.
I guess I'd like to close out with a reading from In the Life, last couple of paragraphs of Joseph Beam. Many of the brothers in this book passed away from HIV/AIDS. This was the revolution that they saw in the 1980s, a revolution. What they were inspired by, a lot of African-American women's writing about loving each other. And the revolutionary mantra is Black men loving Black men is the Revolutionary Act. Black men loving Black men is a revolution act of the 1980s, not only because 60s revolutionaries like Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver dare to speak our name, but because As Black men, we were never meant to be together, not as father or son, brother and brother, and certainly not as lovers. Black men loving Black men is an autonomous agenda for the 80s, which is not rooted in any particular sexual, political, or class affiliation, but in our mutual survival. The ways in which we manifest that love are as myriad as issues we must address: unemployment, substance abuse, self-hatred, the lack of positive images, but are some of the barriers of our longing. Black men loving Black men is a call to action, an acknowledgement of our responsibility. We take care of our own kind when the night grows cold and silent. The days and the nights are cold, bloody, and silence echoes our complicity. And so I just want to leave that there, that message of loving each other. And it's just wonderful having this time together to say, whether I know you or not, I love you.
Thank you, Mark. Alex?
Oh, wow, I'm not sure I have much to say after that beautiful reading. I just want to say thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure. I also wanted to clarify, just so your audience knows, everyone has an intersectional identity. It's not just multiply oppressed people who have intersectional identities. If you're a straight, white, cis man, you also have an intersectional identity, and it is very important to understand those intersections as well. But that's all I want to leave you with.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you, Reverend Mark. Thank you, Jenna, for co-moderating. And thank you all for being here. We had over 100 people join on this call, and you all came for different reasons. Some of you was to feel seen and heard, and for some of you it was to see and hear. And I just want to recognize all of you. Thank you all for participating in this conversation to help create a trauma-informed society. We invite you to come back again. We have our next conversation on Tuesday about, is it creating trauma-informed communities? Something like that, Jenna? We have one that we do every single Thursday on K through 12 education, which is remarkable, creating safer spaces in K through 12 that are trauma-informed. And then next Friday, oh my gosh.
Grief, is that on grief and COVID with Tian?
Yes, and she's an addiction therapist. So that came up in conversation. I'm also an addiction survivor. So I will definitely be there for that one. Thank you all so much. Mark, Alex, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Yeah, thank you all so much.